What if everything you worked for, every sacrifice you made, went unnoticed? What if you were told your efforts didn't matter, that you didn't belong? This is the story of one woman's fight to be seen, heard, and valued in a system that was determined to keep her in the shadows. Angela had always dreamed of making a difference in healthcare, of rising to a position where her voice could be heard. But at St. Mary's Hospital, every step she took seemed to push her further away from that dream. Systemic bias, disrespect, and a toxic work environment made her feel like she didn't belong, like she was invisible. She felt trapped, surrounded by walls that didn't seem to care about her skills or her ambition. But Angela wasn't one to give up without a fight. This was just the beginning of her story. Every day, Angela walked into St. Mary's Hospital with a sense of hope, ready to do her part in helping the patients and making a positive impact. But no matter how hard she tried, she felt like she was invisible. Her ideas were dismissed before they could even take shape, and her contributions were often overlooked. As a woman in a male-dominated field, Angela quickly learned that her voice didn't carry the same weight as her colleagues. She felt isolated, as though the more she fought to prove herself, the further she was pushed to the margins. The constant undermining wore her down, and the toxic environment only made it harder to stay motivated. Angela could feel the pressure building, the quiet discouragement that made her question whether she would ever rise above the limitations others had placed on her. But things began to shift when Mr. Edwards walked into the hospital. Mr. Edwards was an experienced administrator, someone with a reputation for turning hospitals around. His arrival should have been a reason for hope, a chance for change. But for Angela, it was a double-edged sword. While some viewed him as a beacon of change, she soon realized that his presence meant more challenges. His management style, though efficient, lacked the empathy and understanding Angela had hoped for. His methods echoed the very same institutional biases that had held her back for so long. St. Mary's was a place where hierarchy was everything, and the system itself seemed designed to keep the voices of the people at the bottom from ever being heard. Angela wasn't the only one feeling the weight of the institution's rigid structure. She knew there were others just like her, caught in a system that stifled their potential. And yet, despite all the obstacles, Angela refused to accept that this would be her fate. She knew something had to change, but how could she fight against a system so deeply entrenched in its ways? At first, Mr. Edwards seemed like the answer to Angela's prayers. When he walked into her office one morning and asked about her thoughts on the hospital's future, it felt like a lifeline. For so long, Angela had fought alone, but now, for the first time in a long while, someone was truly listening. Mr. Edwards didn't just acknowledge the challenges she faced, he understood them. His words weren't empty promises, they were filled with purpose and direction. He saw potential in Angela, a potential she had almost given up on herself. He offered mentorship, advice, and a glimpse of a future where women like her could be taken seriously, where respect and equality weren't just buzzwords, but a reality. Angela felt seen in a way that no one at St. Mary's had ever made her feel before. They spent hours together, discussing ways to improve the workplace, focusing on more opportunities for everyone, regardless of their gender, race, or background. They both knew that change wouldn't come easily, but for the first time, Angela felt hope. She believed in Mr. Edwards' vision of a hospital where talent and hard work were recognized, where people weren't held back by outdated traditions and institutional barriers. For once, Angela dared to dream of a future where her hard work and dedication would be valued. But as they dug deeper into the hospital's inner workings, reality began to settle in. The more Angela and Mr. Edwards explored the system, the more they realized just how deeply ingrained the issues at St. Mary's were. The hospital wasn't just a workplace that needed reform, it was a microcosm of a larger societal problem. What they were fighting against wasn't just poor management, it was an entire culture that refused to adapt. Change wasn't just an idea, it was a battle against years of tradition and resistance. At every turn, Angela and Mr. Edwards encountered quiet but firm opposition. The same people who had been in positions of power for decades seemed determined to keep things as they were. There were subtle ways they tried to keep the status quo intact, dismissing new ideas, resisting discussions of diversity, and downplaying the need for improvement. It was clear that these people weren't just standing in the way of progress, they were actively protecting a system that had served them well for years. Angela's hope began to waver as she saw just how deeply the resistance ran. She realized that the challenges they were facing went beyond just St. Mary's. They were facing a battle against a broader, institutionalized mindset that was reluctant to change. And yet, despite the mounting obstacles, Angela wasn't ready to give up. As she spent more time with Mr. Edwards, she started to see a way forward. They weren't just discussing small reforms anymore, they were gearing up to challenge everything, to take on a system that had been this way for generations. With each meeting, Angela felt a sense of urgency building. She knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take every ounce of strength and courage to push forward, but she wasn't in this fight alone. She had Mr. Edwards by her side, and together, they began to form a strategy. Their meetings were no longer just about identifying problems, they were about finding solutions, even if those solutions meant taking risks. As they worked late into the night, discussing plans for leadership change, diversity training, and internal policies, Angela could feel the weight of the challenge ahead. Every step they took, every decision they made, felt like a small victory, but it also felt like a battle, one they were determined to win. This wasn't just about changing St. Mary's. It was about making a statement, about showing everyone that the system could be broken, that change was possible, and that voices like Angela's, though often silenced, could rise up and make a difference. Then came the day that everything changed. The atmosphere in the boardroom was tense, the silence almost deafening as Mr. Edwards called the meeting. The stakes were high, and everyone knew it. For weeks, he had been preparing for this moment, and today, the hospital's leadership would hear the truth. As he stood before the board, his presence commanded attention. No longer was he a newcomer trying to fit in, he was a force, one that had seen enough to understand the depth of the hospital's problems. Mr. Edwards didn't hold back. He laid it all out. St. Mary's had been failing, and everyone in the room knew it. Failing its staff, failing its patients, and perhaps most painfully, failing itself. The hospital had become a place where outdated systems had thrived for far too long, where those in power clung to control, and where change was seen as a threat. He spoke plainly, no fluff, no sugarcoating. The institution had allowed itself to grow stagnant, and that stagnation was now a cancer eating away at the core of the hospital. It had been running on a system of privilege, where certain people had the power and the resources, while others were left to fight for scraps. Mr. Edwards took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. He knew this was risky. By challenging the status quo, he was not just questioning the leadership, he was exposing years of neglect, of poor decision-making, of complacency. But he also knew that if things didn't change now, if this moment was not seized, then St. Mary's would continue its downward spiral. It would become irrelevant, a place where even the most talented doctors and nurses would leave, discouraged and unappreciated. Angela stood beside him. Her heart raced, but her voice was steady, firm. She had never felt more certain of her purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. The changes they had been pushing for weren't abstract goals or idealistic dreams. They were real, tangible actions, actions that could transform the culture of St. Mary's. She echoed Mr. Edwards' words, reinforcing his message with unwavering conviction. This was the moment when they could no longer be ignored. Their voices had been silenced for too long, but now, together, they had power. But the room wasn't silent for long. There were whispers, murmurs of disbelief, of resistance. The people who had benefited from the old system, those who had always been in control, were beginning to show their true colors. Angela saw the discomfort on their faces. They didn't like the idea of giving up their positions of privilege. They didn't like the idea of sharing power. They pushed back, trying to make Mr. Edwards and Angela feel like outsiders, questioning their intentions, their plans, even their qualifications. But Angela wasn't intimidated. She had faced worse before. She had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated her whole life. Yet, Here she was, standing alongside Mr. Edwards, speaking the truth to the people who thought they could keep things the way they always had been. She had earned her place at the table, and she wasn't going to let anyone push her back down. The board members were growing increasingly agitated, but Angela remained calm. She could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the room focused on her, but this time, she wasn't afraid. This wasn't just about making a change in St. Mary's, it was about making the system work for everyone, not just for the privileged few who had been enjoying the benefits for years. The battle wasn't over yet, and Angela knew that. But as she stood there, speaking her truth, she felt an overwhelming sense of power. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or ignored. The future was uncertain, and there were many challenges still to come. But this day, this meeting, would be remembered as the moment everything changed. In the end, all the hard work and dedication paid off. The policies that Angela and Mr. Edwards had worked tirelessly to put in place began to take root. Slowly but surely, St. Mary's started to transform into a place that valued equality, diversity, and respect for all its staff and patients. What had once felt like an uphill battle started to show signs of progress. Angela's role in the hospital grew, and she became a symbol of what could be accomplished when someone refused to accept the status quo and demanded change. It wasn't an easy road. There were plenty of hurdles along the way, moments when it felt like they had taken one step forward only to be pushed 2 steps back. But Angela's determination made all the difference. Her belief in the possibility of a better future, despite the setbacks, kept her going. As the changes they fought for spread across the hospital, Angela found herself in a position of power, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or dismissed. Her voice was now one that was heard and respected. What began as a small spark of hope had grown into a full-blown movement. Angela's efforts were inspiring other hospitals to follow suit, to rethink their systems, and to create environments where everyone had an equal opportunity to succeed. Angela had gone from feeling invisible in a system that ignored her to becoming a driving force for change. And through it all, she realized it was never just about the hospital. It was about giving everyone, regardless of their background, the chance to be heard, seen, and respected. If you believe that change is possible, no matter the challenge, share this story. Let's continue fighting for a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued.